So here we are, ready to start our latest Mibbes Aye programme for January 2023. And it wasn't what we were going to do, was it?
No, it wasn't. 2023 was going to be the year of the referendum, so we were going to do a countdown. We were going to do a series of programmes as we got closer to the referendum, but that plan is now in the bin. So what's our plan B?
Yeah, so plan B.
We're calling this episode a Constitutional Conundrum. And that really is where we are. So having had the Supreme Court judgment that's blown our plan A out of the water, we're now going to have a look at some of the fallout from that. And in particular, we've got two different events we're going to draw on. One is a Glasgow Southside Zoom meeting with Professor Aileen McHarg, and the other was an Opposition Day debate at Westminster called by the SNP on the topic of this is no longer a voluntary union, how do we leave?
And the answer to how we leave and how that conundrum can be solved is actually quite straightforward. Westminster just amends the 1999 Scotland Bill to put the power of calling a Section 30 into the hands of Holyrood. That's the easy way to do it. And that's what that motion and amendment was about. And we'll not give away too much in advance, but I bet anyone watching us now will put odds on which way the vote went.
Yeah, indeed. We've got these clips sort of blended together.
Just to apologise a little bit, because the quality of sound from Aileen's end was just a bit intermittent, and we, at various points in the meeting we stopped when we tried to sort that out and we couldn't do it. So it's not the best of sound, but it really, really is worthwhile, really kind of focusing in and finding out what she has to say.
We've got four main themes coming out of it. So the first batch of clips, they're all just very short, is on that question of the right to self-determination. Who can hold a referendum?
So let us consider then, because we've not done it yet, the results of the 2021 general election in Scotland, where this was a central campaign point. Well, I'm sorry for those that haven't been following this, perhaps, but we won. Not only did my party win the election, it won it with more votes than it has ever received in a Holyrood election. The results were quite clear. The SNP won that election in any normal terms. In fact, it was the best election result that we have had in terms of the number of votes that we received. And our colleagues in the Scottish Green Party, who stood on an almost identical platform in terms of the referendum, did exceedingly well as well. Together, the Scottish Green Party and the SNP had 72 seats out of 129 in that legislature, and they have formed a governing coalition in order to discharge their mandate. That is a bigger pro-independence majority than we had in 2011, when Alex Salmond had the first independence referendum. So the question arises, why was a response from David Cameron that was good enough in 2011 to that result not replicated in 2021 by the then Tory Prime Minister?
I wonder.
Scotland is outnumbered in Westminster, so how can it have any self-determination?
I agree with that. I think it's difficult to understand a principle of self-determination that is dependent on somebody else agreeing to exercise it. However, we have precedents for the UK Parliament agreeing to the exercise of self-determination, not just in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland. So, yes, I agree from a principle point of view, it feels very odd, but it doesn't make it impossible if at the political level that right to self-determination is accepted.
The Scots as a nation have an undoubted right to national self-determination. Thus far, they have exercised that right by joining and remaining in the Union. Should they, that's us, determine on independence, no English party or politician would stand in their way, however much we might regret their departure. What have we come to, Mr Deputy Speaker? When the late Margaret Thatcher, for indeed she it was, the late Margaret Thatcher shows more respect for the rights of the people than the Scottish Labour Party. So, Mr Speaker, this motion is not a plea to our superiors from a subservient people. This is a clear statement from a sovereign people about the direction that our country intends to take. It's an opportunity for those who claim to support the British Constitution to allow that Constitution to do its job.
I'm very grateful while my honourable friend is getting straight to the heart of the material cost and opportunity cost of remaining languishing in this union. He talks about how the United Kingdom just went straight on ahead with their referendum to leave the EU. Has he ever considered, as I have, that if you put the boot on the other foot and say, for example, England wanted to leave this union, who would block England leaving the union the way we're being blocked?
Well, indeed, that is correct.
Why should citizens in Ireland, Northern Ireland I should say, have more rights than citizens in Scotland?
The position of Northern Ireland and the fact that it's ignored always is really, really interesting. If you try to raise questions of consistency with Northern Ireland, you're always kind of bobbed off with, well, Northern Ireland's different. And of course, it is different. It has a different political history and a much more problematic political history, and there is the international dimension of it. And of course, their right is it's not the right to secede, it's a right to become part of the United Ireland, so it's quite a limited right. Nevertheless, there is a clear inconsistency there, and I think more could be made of that in political terms, because a lot of the things that are said about referendums in the Scottish context, the once in a generation thing, well, you're already beyond what constitutes a generation in Northern Irish terms. It's only 7 years, and we were already 8 years on from the first referendum. Arguments about the need for 60% support in the polls, or 70%, or supermajorities, all of these things, those don't apply in the Northern Irish context either. The trigger for a border poll is if it appears in the Secretary of State that a majority would vote for one, and it has been quite persuasively argued that any border poll would be on a 50% plus one basis, and it would be unlawful, it would be a breach of the Good Friday Agreement if it were anything higher than that. So again, why is there this inconsistency that's accepted? Yes, there are differences in Northern Ireland, but why are they relevant? And that's the question I think is those questions are definitely worth continuing to ask.
A parish council in England and a district or other council in England, the tier of local government directly below the Westminster Parliament, has the power to organise a referendum on anything, including housing, the borders of its boundaries, but the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the power to conduct a referendum on a matter that it sees.
But if the UK Government, backed up by their Better Together allies, continue to veto or ignore the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government, then it stands to reason that a different kind of electoral test will be needed. The 2019 general election, 3 years ago this week, was an effective, or you might even say a de facto, referendum on Brexit. The Conservatives sought a mandate to implement the hardest possible Brexit short of a no deal. The Liberal Democrats, none of whom appear to be here today, but if memory serves, the Liberal Democrats sought a mandate in that general election to completely overturn the referendum result on Brexit. And the SNP manifesto supported a UK-wide second EU referendum with Remain on the ballot paper, while making clear that the best option for Scotland is, and always has been, independence in Europe. So political parties are absolutely entitled to put their proposition to the voters, and the voters make up their mind. Labour, apparently, intends to stand at the next election on a platform for sweeping constitutional reform, abolition of the House of Lords, a new devolution settlement, even though Labour established the current devolution settlement through a series of referendums. But their position now seems to be that a Labour government elected on 45% of the vote, maybe, of the UK-wide vote, would have a mandate to completely reform the United Kingdom Constitution, to completely reform the current devolution settlement, but an overall majority of votes for pro-independence candidates in Scotland would not constitute a mandate for anything. I'm not sure how they make that add up.
Westminster can call one. England can, because nobody would be able to outvote them. Northern Ireland can, because of the Good Friday Act. Constitutional reform, the Tories can do it. Labour could do it if they were in power. The SNP can't, because they don't have the numbers. English county councils, as we found out from that Zoom with Aileen, they can do it.
I'm guessing that maybe, someone from Westminster government would say, oh, look, come on, it's a bit much to say that English county councils have the right to hold constitutional referendums, and Scotland doesn't. But they do have the right to have a referendum to look at where the boundaries of their counties are, and it's a constitutional matter for their area of authority. And I think it's fair enough, actually, to sort of make a comparison with, Holyrood doesn't have the power, as we now know, to make any decisions on constitutional matters.
The Supreme Court have seen to it that the door is closed on the idea of Holyrood having a referendum. So let's start looking at some of the other options.
No referendum bill can be introduced into the Scottish Parliament unless and until the Scotland Act is amended, and since that seems very unlikely to happen, it means there won't be a referendum next October. The Scotland Act could be amended in one of two ways, or two main ways. You could get another Section 30 order, as in 2014, to authorise a referendum on a one-off basis, or you could have a permanent amendment setting out the circumstances and the conditions under which referendums in general can be held. So that would be similar to the situation under the Northern Ireland Act, which regulates the holding of referendums on Irish unification. It sets out conditions under which referendums can be triggered and a minimum time period of 7 years between referendums. So we could have an ad hoc amendment, or we could have a more kind of permanent, more detailed regulation of the issue. So that makes the achievement of independence primarily a political issue. It becomes a question of persuading the UK Parliament to legislate for it.
The polity that we live in the United Kingdom is a multinational state made up and based upon serial acts of union that have given it quite a unique character. And it is something which, up until very recently, we had assumed required on the consent of the people in the component nations of the United Kingdom to be part of. We now have a situation following the Supreme Court judgment where it seems that that is not the case, that it is not possible for one group of people in one nation of the United Kingdom to consider reviewing the relationship with the others without their consent. And that means that the idea of it being a voluntary union of nations is dead in the water until such times as the law is clarified or fixed. And it is in an attempt to clarify and fix the British Constitution that we actually present this bill to the House today, because if you pass this motion, it will then allow for a situation for the leader of my party to do what the leader of the government ought to have done, and that is bring forward amendments to the 98 Act to allow the Scottish Parliament the power and competence to be able to do the things that the Supreme Court ruled it could not do, and which everyone thought previously it was able to do.
And we're here talking about Scotland's future because we're stuck. We're in a constitutional conundrum. We've got a situation that we can't get out of. We've got a situation that there's no way out of. And that was proven by the Supreme Court judgment. The Supreme Court judgment effectively said there is no current democratic way for the people of Scotland to get out of this union, even if they want to. Even if the people of Scotland, which they continually do, vote for parties that support having an independence referendum, even if they keep doing that, there is no way out of this situation without the UK Government giving a Section 30 order. There is no way out of this voluntary union of nations. We are stuck in this voluntary union, whether we like it or not. We're stuck in this. And the opposition, in fact, both sides, from the Labour Party and the Conservatives, seem to think it's some sort of oddity, some sort of unusual situation that people in this place would be keen to talk about constitutional reform. In some odd way, apparently, the SNP are the only ones that have got any interest in constitutional reform in this House. From a party that's passed the recent Elections Act, changing the way that people vote, that's changing the parliamentary constituencies and reducing the number of parliamentary constituencies, from a party that is desperate to abolish the House of Lords. I mean, we've heard that before. From a party that has previously said that they would abolish the House of Lords, from parties that have spent decades and decades tinkering with the Constitution, making changes, and are still doing it, are still making constitutional changes, are still talking about the repeal of EU law bill, are still talking about Brexit and what a wonderful bonus it is. That is all constitutional change. The only difference between our party talking about constitutional change and their parties talking about constitutional change is that we are doing it consistently, pointing in the same direction, all of us standing up, fighting for independence for the people of Scotland. That is the constitutional change we are speaking for with one voice.
Yeah, so if you're listening to Kirsty there, you'll have seen where we got the title for this programme from, and she used it, a constitutional conundrum. And I was just quite struck with it. She says, well, we're stuck. And that's it, isn't it? We're stuck. I mean, I'm sure we'll find a way, and a way will emerge, and we'll find a way out of it. But at the moment, we're stuck. And I was quite struck, again, when she said, oh, and, the other parties in this House seem to think it's strange to want to talk about constitutional matters. But the Labour Party have just said, they're going to abolish the House of Lords. That'll be in their next manifesto. That Scottish interests can't do anything, or if they want to talk about it, they get people's responses of, oh, you're always talking about constitutional matters, and as she says, well, the Labour Party are talking about abolishing the House of Lords, but we have heard that before from them. I think the first time they said it was 1921.
When Gordon Brown was a young man. Let's see how the vote went.
The ayes to the right, 42. The noes to the left, 265.
Right, so that was 42 for the motion and 265 voted against
Wow.
it.
But it was really good that they were all there listening, wasn't it? Oh, no, wait a minute, actually they weren't.
Let's just have a little look at the benches during the debate and see if you can spot 265 people. What really annoys me actually is that 260 of those 265 people do not represent Scottish constituencies. So they're voting against the wishes of the people of another country. It's outrageous. What about the claim of right? There just seems to be so many different perspectives on this, so many different views, from people who absolutely think it's the answer to people who dismiss it completely, and everybody else is somewhere in the middle. So drawing from both of these events we've been looking at, and also tapping into what I thought was a very well-delivered speech by Leah Gunn Barrett at the Time for Scotland event, let's just have a look at the sort of range of views.
Let's watch them. And personally, I haven't made my mind up about, just how crucial or important the claim of right is. In modern times, obviously crucial and important way back in 1689. But yeah, for me, it throws up more questions. So yeah, have a watch of these clips and see what questions it gets thrown up for yourself.
Now, much of this is bound up with the notion of the claim of right for Scotland. And we had a big debate, and as colleagues may remember, in 2018, actually again with an opposition to a motion put forward by my party, when there was a surprising degree of support from all sides of the House for the claim of right for Scotland. The claim of right simply says, by the way, that it asserts the right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. It was a declaration formulated in its current form in 1989. It's been referred to ever since, and actually in the last time round, and I'm glad to see one of them present, we had the then Secretary of State for Scotland and the current leader of the Scottish Tories stand up in that debate and say that they endorsed and supported the claim of right for Scotland. Well, you cannot have the claim of right for Scotland and a situation where we don't live in a voluntary union and it can never be exercised. Because it is remarkable how uncontroversial this assertion has been over the years, to be honest. I mean, from '89 onwards, I mean, we had it, it underpinned the '97 legislation which led to the referendum and devolution. It was asserted in the Calman Position Commission that followed that. It underpinned, obviously, the 2014 referendum, and it was asserted in the Smith Commission that came as a consequence of that. And we've never had it seriously challenged. In fact, I've been debating these matters about the Government of Scotland. I had it up the other day for 45 years, since I was a student at Aberdeen University and campaigning in the first devolution referendum in 1979. And in all of that time, it has been understood that the claim of right exists up until now. So it is important, I think, that we reassert it.
Aileen, is there a mechanism within the claim of right where the Scottish Government or the Scottish people could enact independence?
The powers of the Scottish Parliament are limited by the Scotland Act. There's no alternative source of powers that they can draw upon or refer to. So that's one point. So I understand the argument that's made in relation to the claim of right, that this is evidence of a right to rebellion, or that was part of pre-Union Scots law. There's certainly grounds for supporting that position in the claim of right itself, but there was a contested constitutional doctrine pre-Union. It is highly uncertain that it survived the Union, and even if it has survived the Union, none of the details are worked out there. What is a right of rebellion, a residual right of rebellion for the Scottish people? How is that operationalised? Who puts it into practice? What are the trigger conditions for it? Who decides? You decide, okay. But, you know, so there's a whole load of steps that would have to be filled in that would be hugely, hugely controversial. So that I just don't think that that historical material is nearly as powerful as some people think it is or hope it is.
Hi, thank you and good evening. Today's UK Supreme Court decision is not only irrelevant, it's illegal. Because Scotland's constitution is in force, in principle and under international law. There was never any need for the SNP leadership to ask another nation's court for permission to do something we've always had the power to do for ourselves. The principle of the sovereignty of the Scottish people over any government or parliament was upheld in the 1689 Claim of Right, which was inserted into the 1707 Treaty of Union by the Scottish negotiators as a precondition of the treaty and of the Union. It was ratified by the two parliaments as a guarantee that the Scottish Constitution would remain in force after the UK was created. In fact, recently, King Charles III swore allegiance to the Claim of Right, and Westminster has acknowledged it on 3 separate occasions, in 1989, 2012, and 2018. By contrast, England's unwritten constitution is based on parliamentary sovereignty over the people, which is the polar opposite of Scotland's popular sovereignty. Westminster is not sovereign in Scotland, the people are. The Claim of Right gives the Scottish people the power to sack a government that fails to uphold their rights and interests. The Convention of the Estates, a tribunal of Scottish citizens, had the power to depose a corrupt government and replace it with one that served the common good and upheld the people's sovereignty.
I don't think there's a plausible argument that can be made that as a matter of domestic constitutional law, Scotland has a legally enforceable right to become independent. And I know there are a variety of arguments that have been put forward in this area, most recently arguments based around the Claim of Right. But in legal terms, these are very weak arguments, as well as historically highly contentious. And it's very, very unlikely, in my view, that you will ever persuade a court. In the contemporary constitutional order, the people of Scotland have a legal right to secede from the UK under domestic law. And in any case, they come nowhere near, even if these fragmentary legal principles and precedents mean anything, they don't come anywhere close to establishing a clearly set out pathway towards independence.
In 1707, Scottish Parliament was not dissolved, it was put into abeyance. It has now been taken out of abeyance, and the laws that were pertaining to the Scottish Parliament back in 1706 to 1707 were not repealed. So they are still live.
In legal terms, it's a highly controversial statement to say that the contemporary Scottish Parliament is just the reincarnation of the pre-Union Scottish Parliament. I mean, it's institutionally nothing like it, and its legal provenance, it is an act of the UK Parliament, not some sort of historical route. And it's also problematic to say that everything that was in existence pre-1707 somehow survives unchanged. I mean, some of it was changed by the Treaty of Union. It just was. And the Treaty of Union states that it is permanent. It doesn't contain a mechanism for its own dissolution. And we're talking about centuries ago. You know, the law, some aspects of the law have continued in force, but large parts of it, and particularly our understandings of how we should be governed and what the legitimate principles of democratic government are fundamentally different to what they were in 1707. So I think there's all sorts of technical and also principled objections to the idea that somehow we can just revive the 1707 constitution and somehow put that into effect.
So as we said, a really wide range of views there, and some contradictory views, some assertions that we don't know what the evidence is they're based on, some questions certainly would arise. So I think this is something we will return to. On the one hand, if it's got the possibility of helping us get where we want to get, then it's definitely worth looking more closely at. And on the other hand, if it's a non-starter, why are we putting all this energy and effort into it if it's leading us down a blind alley? So I just don't know what the answer is right now.
Yeah. I mean, we all feel frustrated about where we are at the moment in the independence campaign. I completely understand, you know, that posing a question, is this the way out? And now it's got to, it is the way out in some people's minds. Of course, that kind of, in a way, answers that frustration. You know, it kind of taps into what we're all feeling very strongly. But it's got to be backed up, and it's got to have real possibility of going somewhere. Otherwise, it's a blind alley.
Yeah, but it could just be a magic wand as well. So definitely worth taking a closer look at.
Absolutely.
It's not all doom and gloom, though, as our last collection of clips will suggest there are lots of other avenues that we can be exploring.
The thing that's really struck me over the past few years, UK politicians, of course, have been saying repeatedly, no, you can't have a referendum. But that has always been justified in terms of timing. You can't have a referendum now for X, Y, and Z reasons. Apart from, on the fringes of unionism, there hasn't been any rejection of the principle that at some point, whenever that might be, at some point, it is possible for Scotland to become independent. Now, and you can find plenty of political statements, political precedents to support this. And that's important. The UK constitution is not a wholly legal constitution. It is partly a political constitution. So political precedents and principles and statements do matter. Nevertheless, the UK constitution is, as things currently stand, entirely silent on the circumstances in which we can succeed or what the precise pathway towards secession might be. We're just in a situation of complete legal silence and political disagreement.
We're trying to find a way forward in all of these issues and trying to design a way to deal with the situation that we now find ourselves in. Now, my colleagues have repeatedly asked government ministers from the Prime Minister downwards, how do we therefore now get that independence referendum when we are supposedly and notionally in a voluntary union? We've not had any real answer or response to that, save for one thing, a duck. That was the response that I got when I asked the Secretary of State for Scotland at the Scottish Affairs Committee, how do we do this now? And he said the response was the duck test. I think what the Secretary of State was trying to suggest and present was that we would just know when we got to the situation position when a referendum on independence would be reasonable and legitimate. And of course he now has that fabled duck test. If it looks like a duck and if it quacks like a duck, honourable members know how the rest of this goes. So I think what he was saying was that if it looks like it's time for an independence referendum, if it sounds like it's time for an independence referendum, then it will be time for that independence referendum. The only thing is he didn't actually tell us how that democratic test would be met. I presented a few options to him which were all rejected. So it's now incumbent upon this government to tell us how we get there. They've conceded that there is a way to an independence referendum, albeit by the guise of our aquatic feathered friends. What they now have to do is to sit down reasonably and constructively and tell us exactly what that test will be.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to talk about ducks. Thank you to the member for Perth and North Perthshire for mentioning the duck test. He says that there is a duck test in relation to the referendum. That is apparently the position of the front bench over there. So if it looks like it's time for a referendum, and if it sounds like it's time for a referendum, then it's time for a referendum. Now, I hope that the Deputy Speaker will not mind me saying the party doesn't have a very good track record on determining whether or not it's a duck. Because if it looks like a party, and it sounds like a party, it's in fact a work event. If it looks like a drive to Barnard Castle, and it sounds like a drive breaking COVID rules, it's in fact completely legitimate and perfectly normal for people to do that. And definitely not an eyesight test, indeed, and definitely not against COVID rules. Mr Deputy Speaker, I have got some questions for the Minister about his plan for how Scotland could choose to determine its constitutional future. I've got some questions about exactly what he's said in this. And, you know, I'll move away slightly from the duck test. He's said what we need is we need all of the parties. We need all of the parties, and we need civic society in Scotland to come forward in order to have a referendum. Now, thinking back to the Brexit referendum, is it possible that not all of the parties supported having a Brexit referendum? Is it possible that that dramatic constitutional change was not supported by every single party in this House? I mean, I think it is possible that that was the case. I think it is possible that every party in this House did not come together and support constitutional change. I think it's possible that in 2011, prior to the Scottish Parliament election in 2011, the Conservative and Unionist Party didn't put in their manifesto that they would support an independence referendum. I don't think it was in the, I assume it wasn't in the manifesto of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. I think it's incredibly odd for the Government Minister to suggest that every party should need to support something before. Does he mean the Labour Party and the Conservatives and the SNP? Does he mean the Labour Party, the Conservatives, the SNP and the Lib Dems? Does he include Plaid? Does he include the SDLP? Does he include the DUP? Does every party across the UK need to have in their manifesto that they're going to have a referendum on Scottish independence in order for that to happen? What does he mean by every party? Does he really mean every party? It would be great if he could provide some answers to this. Does he mean every party that gets over a certain percentage of the vote? If so, what's that threshold? What is the threshold? Do they have to have it in their manifesto, or do they simply have to make the agreement afterwards?
A petition dissolving Holyrood and have an election in Holyrood. Civil disobedience.
There are multiple political tactics that could be considered. It wouldn't be impossible, I don't think, to engineer a dissolution of Holyrood if the Scottish Government resigns and blocks the formation of an alternative government within 28 days. General election would have to be held, so to treat that one as as a plebiscite election. But again, that has all the problems with the voters being willing to go along with that. Would the other parties go along with it? Would you be punished for it? And since the power to legislate for a referendum is now firmly at Westminster, you might get objections that it doesn't matter what the Scottish Parliament says anymore on this point because it's reserved. But multiple potential political avenues are available. There isn't one pathway, and there's no guaranteed pathway.
So what is to be done? Well, first of all, we can endorse our historical claim of right, as Canon Kenyon Wright said. Some may say no, but we are the people, if I paraphrase, and we say yes. So I hope that SNP members will sign my colleague Neil Hanvey's St Andrew's Day Declaration, EDM 633. The Independence Convention requires to be supported. It's necessary for two reasons: to bring together the elected, democratically elected representatives of Scotland, our MPs and MSPs. It's required, first of all, to rebut that it's not the UK Supreme Court that is sovereign, it's the democratically elected representatives of the people of Scotland. And secondly, to drive home, when this motion fails and is defeated tonight, that it's not this Parliament, but the elected representatives of the people of Scotland who are the voice, democratically elected, of the people of Scotland. So I hope that members on the SNP benches will support the call for an independence convention. After all, it was a call made and supported by the First Minister in February 2020. We're now approaching 3 years on. It's time that convention was delivered. Thirdly, they should support the call for a plebiscite election, one that could be triggered next October and deliver us our referendum, the no ifs, no buts referendum that we were promised by members on the SNP benches. That can be achieved by collapsing the Scottish Parliament. A member of the SNP has already set out a way there. That could be done and could deliver the referendum that the people of Scotland were promised by the First Minister and others that would happen in October of next year. That must be done. And finally, support must be given to all demonstrations, all international legal actions, all actions peaceful and democratic, to drive forward the position that the people of Scotland are not prepared to supinely accept diktat either from a UK Supreme Court or from a Tory government unelected by the people of Scotland since 1955.
It's a de facto referendum. This isn't a constitutionally regulated or recognised concept. There are precedents for single-issue elections. You have to go quite a long way back to find them, but there are precedents. Nevertheless, this is a political tactic. This is a way of putting pressure on the UK Parliament to come to the UK government to come to the table. Because it's a political tactic, I think it's maybe a bit of a mistake to get too worked up about the details of what matters. Or what counts as a mandate. The SNP and the other pro-independence parties are entirely free if they want to campaign on a single issue. They can't guarantee, of course, that the other parties or the voters will go along with it, but it might. And if they get support on that basis, they are entitled to see their view as having been endorsed. Clearly, also, I think this approach, it's suboptimal compared to a referendum. It's suboptimal for reasons of clarity over the process and the result. It's a politically risky tactic. The electorate is not all that favourable towards the independence case compared to the franchise that would apply for a referendum. So it's suboptimal, but with all that's available to you are political tactics, it is a political tactic that can be used. If it turns out that support for the SNP or the SNP plus the other pro-independence parties was sufficiently high, then all of these quibbles about what constitutes a majority and where people are really voting for independence, all that would become mere quibbles. It wouldn't really matter if support was sufficiently high.
Is there any way that, as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon could recall all our Scottish political representation and create a convention assembly and dissolve the union?
Well, so that would be UDI, so Unilateral Declaration of Independence. UDI is not unlawful under international law. Now that might sound a little bit contradictory because I just said there's no right to secede under international law, but a right to do something and no ban on doing something, these are different things. So there's no right to secede, but at the same time, unilateral declarations of secession are not contrary to international law. The problem with UDI is that, as the ICJ has clearly recognised, there is no obligation on any other states to recognise the UDI. And independence is only effective if it's recognised by other states. So you can only become an effective independent state if other states are prepared to recognise you. So sometimes UDIs will be effective, sometimes they will be recognised by other states, sometimes they're partially recognised, i.e. they're recognised by some but not others. In some cases they're not recognised at all. I mean, Catalonia's UDI is obviously the big warning flag there. But even if it was even if we had a sort of partially successful UDI with partial recognition, you can pretty much guarantee that the UK would not recognise it. It took a very long time for the UK to recognise what was then Rhodesia's UDI as our neighbour and as our biggest trading partner and all of those things. That would be a real problem. The other real problem is that we almost certainly wouldn't get back into the EU because Spain would definitely veto us. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So I think for that reason the Scottish Government has always ruled out UDI. By whatever route you get to it, the First Minister's always ruled out UDI because she thinks it would not lead to effective independence, and I think she's right on that.
Our colonial status explains the ongoing plundering of our resources, the feudal system of land ownership, the loss of 4 million Scots who were killed, displaced and deported to overseas English colonies. It explains the vast wealth inequalities, the persistent poverty, the absurdity of an energy-rich nation having fuel-poor citizens, and the lowest state pension in the developed world. It explains decades of Westminster governments we did not vote for, and it explains why Scots don't know their own language, history, and constitution, because the colonial power has suppressed them. And it explains why a UK Supreme Court believes it can tell Scotland what it can and cannot do.
This is a question that's come up quite a bit. It's been thrown up by the Supreme Court, this question of, are we a colony? The reason it's important is because if we are a colony, then we have certain rights. But if we're not a colony, we don't have those rights, which is interesting.
Being a de facto colony, does that mean we can go to the ICJ?
So 2 points to that. One, we can't go to the ICJ because there's no right of individual petition to the International Court of Justice. Only states can take cases or UN organs. So there's no direct pathway to the ICJ. But even so, I don't think it's plausible to say that Scotland is a de facto colony. I mean, there's an important legal difference between colonies and parts of the UK, which is that if you are part of the UK, you're represented in the UK Parliament. Now, I accept, of course, that representation, because of the asymmetry of the UK, is very imbalanced. But nevertheless, there is a fundamental difference between being subject to the decisions of a Parliament that you have no say whatsoever in its deliberations versus one that you are at least formally a part of. And we have the Scottish Parliament. So we do have a high degree of internal self-determination. So I think that the de facto colony arguments are not very plausible as they stand.
I first came across that kind of distinction last year sometime. I thought I must find out a bit more about the whole Quebec independence movement and the decisions that arose from that. They nearly made it in the second referendum, but after that, the Canadian federal government asked the Canadian Supreme Court to look at the question, and I think it was out of that this whole distinction of a colony arose. And if you're a colony, you don't have things like representation in the overall Parliament or wherever the power lies. You can't send representatives to it. There are no examples of you and your people in holding positions of power and authority in that way. So I think that's part of the reason why Scotland can't be described as a colony, because we've got representation. We've got Scots who've been prime ministers. We've got plenty of Scots in positions of authority. So it's worthwhile thinking about and just sort of seeing where you come out of it. Because again, I think emotionally, it's very easy to just kind of slide over and to say, well, we're a colony, and actually, if it's not true, then it's another blind alley.
It is, although there is a certain irony in if we're not a colony, that means we have fewer rights than if we were, when our right of representation, we're just going to get outvoted every time. As we've just seen, 265 people are going to come out the wood. Well, we're probably sat in the bar for the entire debate. They're going to come out, vote against us, and go back to the bar.
Yeah. That's where our emotions get hooked into that. And fair enough, I mean, it's so frustrating. But lay that aside a little bit and then just think, well, we may well be wishing now that the group of Scottish commissioners who put together the 25 articles of the Treaty of Union in 1707, we may well wish that they hadn't done it the way they did, but they did. And there was a group of English commissioners, Scottish commissioners, and there was agreement and there was assent to it by our Parliament in Edinburgh and the English Parliament in London. And yeah, we can go, God, I wish they hadn't done it, but they did. It is frustrating, but as well as we keep saying, no point in heading down blind alleys. We need to put our energy and our focus where it can come to, a good outcome. The Yes movement needs to be careful not to get too caught up or too het up about the whole process of where we are and more where we aren't at the moment, because the main job is what it always has been. It's to persuade only a few more percent, but we do have that percentage of Scots still to persuade, and we're getting there. And ironically, I think the ruling from the Supreme Court has helped that. So far it looks like there's been a significant shift, but we need to shift it some more, and that's what our job is.
You lot are the political activists, not me. You have to decide, work that out. There is no single prescribed route by which you can guarantee that outcome. But it's not an outcome that is impossible, legally impossible to achieve. It's one that is going to have to be brought about by political pressure, political persuasion. And I don't have a better answer than that. Ireland used to be part of the UK and it is no longer. The UK has a history of secession, not a history of secession that I think anyone would want to follow. That does indicate is that it is possible.
And that is the bottom line, isn't it? If they want to avoid all this hassle, get a Section 30 on the table.
Yeah, and I hope people have enjoyed watching this. And yeah, on the one hand, there's a process and we do have to find a way through it. But on the other hand, we also need to persuade that last 5% of Scots to come round to yes, and we need to get on with both of those and not let the one block out the sight of the other.
Okay, but we're starting the new year with polls saying that the independence movement is the majority. So that's got to be a great start to the new year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see where it goes from here. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll be back again next month with another topic, possibly the claim of right. And don't forget, you can get our podcast, has a new episode out every Friday. Get that wherever you get your podcasts.
If you go into our website, you're also able to sign up for our monthly newsletter, and we'll let you know what's going on.